Right. Good morning, everyone, or good evening to those of you dialing in from the US. A very warm welcome to our webinar number 8 in this series. These are the MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific Accelerator webinar series. And welcome to those of you joining us on YouTube as well. My name is Frederick Narbig. I'm the Managing Director for Asia Pacific, based here in Singapore. MedTech Innovator is the world's largest accelerator of startups in medical devices, digital health, and IVD. And as part of our accelerator program, we provide weekly webinars with world-class speakers on a range of topics. Today's topic is health economics and working with payers, where we'll be contrasting the US with Asia Pacific. We are hosting these webinars on a weekly basis every Wednesday, 10 a.m. Singapore time. The first 60 minutes will be live streamed on YouTube, followed by 30 minutes of closed-door Q&A. And that's for our cohort startup companies only. So do join us next week. I believe the topic then will be cybersecurity and data privacy. And with that short introduction, I'll hand over to MedTech Innovator CEO, Paul Grand, for today's session. Paul.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Grand, CEO here at MedTech Innovator. MedTech Innovator, as Frederick mentioned, is an accelerator, and my job here is to make sure that the world's best startups connect with the world's leading experts that can help them bring their products to market and with the maximum value. So that's what we'll be talking about today. As Frederick mentioned, we're going to be focusing today on health economics, working with payers, reimbursement. We're going to be talking about the US, Asia Pacific, all sorts of really interesting topics. This is the stuff that if you're developing a product, you're often sitting there just figuring out, is this thing going to work? How do I make this, at cost or whatever, you're trying to do. And you think maybe payment is something down the road. You're saying that's stuff that, someone else will have to worry about. I don't have to think about those things, but I can promise you, you do have to think about those things, and you have to think about them early. They're not someone else's problem. They're going to be your problem if you haven't figured these out properly, because you may have a really interesting product that's solving a medical need, but if it can't be purchased, you have no value. So we're going to talk about these things, and we're going to do that with a series of experts today. So let me introduce our panelists. They'll tell you a little bit about themselves, the companies they work for, and their role in evidence, in payment, reimbursement, et cetera. So let me start off with Chris Hardesty, who is the Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences for KPMG. Chris.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul, Frederick, and to everyone out there. Good to be interacting with you today. So I'm based in Singapore, looking after the Asia Pacific region for KPMG, primarily operating between public and private sector as it pertains to contracting models for medical innovations, including topics like universal health coverage scheme expansion. And in addition to that, I'm a partner for Pure Land Venture Group, which is a venture fund out here. So looking at east to west as well as west to east scale up of medical technology innovations too. So thanks. Great to be here with you.
Great to have you here. Thanks, Chris. Can't wait to talk all these things, and especially from the lens of someone who invests as well. So that's going to be fun. So let's move on to our second expert panelist, Stephanie Lee, Director of APAC Health Economics and Market Access for Johnson & Johnson. Stephanie.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. I'm Stephanie, and I work for Johnson & Johnson based out of Singapore. I have been in this role for about 7 years now, looking after health economics and market access for the cardiovascular franchises of the medical device companies. And that role is a combination of business partnering, so understanding what commercial strategies are for our franchises, understanding how to develop value propositions and messages for new products that are coming to Asia Pacific, assessing the landscape, payer requirements, developing reimbursement strategies, and executing outcomes research when necessary. So it's a little bit of an end-to-end process for us. But I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Stephanie. So as you see, 3 experts here. Last one from the US, Leslie Weiss from Evidence Matters, CEO. Leslie.
Hello. Thank you guys for inviting me to join. I feel like I'm the old person here, the senior person. I today am the CEO of Evidence Matters, but I started in the device industry a long time ago, and I was the global head of market access for Biomed Orthopedics before they merged with Zimmer, or actually through the merger with Zimmer. And then I was the global vice president of HEMA and health policy for angiodynamics. Previous to that, I worked in pharma. I'm a lawyer, and I have my master's in health economics from the University of Sheffield. I led the team that built the value framework with Abdomed for devices and diagnostics. So I've been in the space probably for a long time. I was one of the pioneers. When bundled payments came to orthopedics, that's when some of the very first people were hired to work in market access in the device space. So it is a newer role, not as new today as it was back then, but when I started, it was a pioneering role. So what I do now primarily in my consulting company is I do a lot more strategy. A lot of the things Stephanie laid out, I used to actually do that and build those things. Today, I try to work with companies, large and small, so that when they are in the conceptual process, I help them to map how they're going to make money. How do you monetize this? How do you get to revenue? Because as you said at the beginning, Paul, making the device or making the solution doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get paid for it. So what I do is help people develop the strategies. And I still work on the Hill some, and I've done a lot of lobbying around like MSIT and a lot of the things that are in place today. I spent years working on those policies within Abdomed. So I have a pretty broad base, and I've worked globally for years. So I look forward to today, and hopefully we can share some important knowledge with your audience.
We are lucky to have you, Leslie. Thanks for being back with us. And it's such a late hour for you. I know it's even later for you than it is for me. We have a really amazing cohort because our companies are global, right? We have companies from all over the world. They're not just from Asia. They're not just from US. They're not just from Europe. They're global. And they do look at all these different markets. And Leslie, you've worked with a number of our companies directly. And I know like companies in Australia, as well as in the US, and help them look across the landscape and understand how to, think about not only the pricing in their local markets, but globally. And we're going to talk more about that today. So thanks again for joining us tonight. We're really lucky to have you here, all of you. So let's start off and talk a little bit about some of the key drivers of health economics in the different regions in Asia Pacific. Let's start with that and maybe talk about some of the trends that you're observing in the Asia Pacific reimbursement and payment environment. So I'm going to start off with Chris on this, and then we'll go to Stephanie. So Chris, some thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Just a few kind of things that occupy me day to day. I think, first of all, one of the greatest health economic transformations is happening in the Asia Pacific region in our population's history, which is the adoption of Sustainable Development Goal number 3 for universal health coverage schemes to the region. So that'll bring in around $2 trillion of additional investment by country governments who have traditionally invested less than 5% of their GDPs in healthcare. So that's a fantastic opportunity. And I think sometimes reimbursement companies tend to think about it in a kind of binary fashion. Should I go that route? Should I not go that route? If you look at the direction of travel in Asia Pacific healthcare, it's definitely moving in the direction of the sort of government taking a rightful step in the administration and design of the financing of the system. So I think that's point number one, is just to be aware that is happening to our populations, But I think secondly, related to that, is there is such a variability in UHC design in the region. Some are taking classical beverage Bismarck concepts from the West and trying to adopt them here in the East. Others are inventing their entirely own schemes. If you look in Singapore, we spend 5% of our GDP on healthcare, but have some of the best outcomes in the world because we have a nationalized health savings account model, right? So there are some variations there, which means as a company, when you are thinking about reimbursement and financing, working with governments, there is a lot of flexibility there for business model innovation and bringing new concepts here to the way that this contracting can be performed. I'll say the last thing, and I'm sure Stephanie and some others will touch on this as well, is just This idea of the health technology assessment, I mean, it's definitely gaining a lot of traction. Most countries now have a dedicated committee to it. Still lacking some capacity and capability there, but I don't think we're moving backwards. I think we're moving forward on that. And in fact, a lot of the discussion these days is not just having a standard HTA, but actually HTA by disease topic or therapeutic area. So it's definitely a fast moving train, and it's one of those you want to get on earlier instead of trying to pretend that it's not going to actually materialize, you know? So those are a few of the things that I work on.
Sounds like a lot of fun. These are great topics. So Stephanie, I know you have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, and I think Chris made some really, really key observations about the trends in Asia Pacific. I would probably just add on only one or two different things, which are around what I would say keeps the big companies up at night, is that there are increasingly stringent requirements from payers in Asia Pacific for us to demonstrate value. So it used to be the case even like 5-10 years ago that you could sort of just promise or claim certain things and then they would take it at face value. But that really is no longer the case. If you don't really have the data to demonstrate that or to, prove it, you're going to be really, really delayed in terms of what, either what payment you can get or when you can launch. All of those things are really, really critical for us in Asia Pacific. And I think maybe Leslie will also touch on this too, but the concept of international price referencing is increasingly happening. Taiwan does this, Japan does this, Australia is doing this. Everyone wants to know, what somebody is paying for this device elsewhere. And so it has implications for your launch sequencing. It didn't happen to us a lot in the devices in the past, I would say, but we're starting to look at it more and more now. Even if the UK is publishing some sort of, nice evaluation and they publish prices transparently, people here in the region are saying, why am I paying for this when the UK is paying this, right? So a lot of these questions are now coming up. Transparency is increasing. Of course, HTA is emerging. Universal healthcare, all of these things. It's a very, very dynamic environment, and Asia Pacific is not sort of like this homogeneous region, right? There's a lot of nuances depending on the markets that you're looking at. So we see a lot of cost controls being implemented. Governments wanting to know what your import prices are for devices when they negotiate pricing. Controls on DRGs, lots of different pilots and reforms. So it's an exciting time to be in market access.
Yeah, it is. I would just also like to add on that one of the most well-developed HTAs in the world is in Asia Pacific, which is in Australia. MSAC has been doing this for a very, very long time. It's extremely well developed, and it's a very rigorous, some would say even more difficult to get through than NICE. So because of their very hard stand on RCTs. So I do think it's important because MSAC publishes, NICE publishes, sometimes you can find NECA's decisions, UNETA publishes decisions. I think it's really important for people to look up anything that's related to what they're thinking of bringing to market. And it'll give them good insight on what these HTAs are thinking and how they're evaluating evidence, which, that's why I named my company Evidence Matters, because I ran into all of these roadblocks. And at the end of the day, it rests with the evidence. You can make all the claims in the world, but if you can't prove it, as Stephanie said, you will just delay your opportunity to get to revenue. So understanding all that in the pre-market so that you can develop the right evidence is going to get you to revenue a lot faster and help you to be successful getting through HTA if you end up having to do that.
Well, Leslie, I know you have a lot more to say on that topic, which we will get into. Let's just cover a little more on the US as well. So you've talked a little bit about Asia Pacific. What about the US? What are some of the big drivers that we're seeing in terms of health economics in the US? What are some of the big trends? You mentioned MSIT before. I know there's all sorts of things happening there. So give us what are some of the hot buttons?
Well, one of the first things I'll say, probably to a lot of people's surprise, America does not have an official HTA process. There are private HTAs that exist. And through Medicare, they can, if they're going for a national coverage decision, then those can be sent out to Duke, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Tech. They'll do assessments. So there are agencies that Medicare will subcontract out to do sort of an HTA, but we don't have a government-run HTA system like you have in other parts of the world. But having said that, the private payers have well-developed HTA systems, but it's not as transparent. And so that's one of the risks, is that you don't really often know how they're really making their decisions. They'll publish the coverage decision, and actually more and more payers are moving toward non-published coverage decisions, which is scaring everybody because, and they're also in a large way moving to these intermediary bodies that started as radiology benefit managers that have expanded significantly. And so you have companies like EVCore, Health Help, AIM, and they specialize in certain areas like cardiology, oncology, radiology, and they make the decisions as to whether or not the payer should cover. And so those are things that anyone that's bringing technology to the US needs to understand. And additionally, 510K, so if it's a supply, it's not going to be reimbursed separately. It's going to be part of whatever the existing procedure is. If it is a therapeutic device, which you often see in cardiology, you'll see in oncology, and in some other vascular diseases, some other diseases. But if you have a therapeutic device, then that's when you're much more likely to see a coverage policy. And then MCIT, that was Medicare, came out and said that if you were a breakthrough device, if the FDA declared you as a breakthrough device, the Medicare would give you full coverage for 4 years. So it was kind of sort of like a managed entry program. Medicare has delayed it twice. It is believed that it's going to be changed dramatically, giving CMS much more power in saying who meets the criteria. That there's going to probably be some basic criteria, not just the designation of breakthrough. So where this is going to land is still open. They're supposed to give an update in December, but from all of my intelligence that I've been getting, it is going to be substantially changed, giving CMS a lot more say in how that program is going to work out. So we shall see. That's kind of where we are in the US today.
All right. So even with these first 10 minutes or so of just discussion, we've navigated some really complex things on a very high level. But but for these startups, these smaller companies, even for a mid-sized company, it sounds pretty daunting to, as I said before, they're just trying to get something approved, prove that it works. And so now we're introducing these concepts that now we have to kind of understand pricing in all these different regions. We have to understand private, non-transparent, bodies. So hopefully, as we're kind of going through this discussion, we can try and call out some ways, that people can research some of these things, can learn about them. Obviously, they can contract with someone like Evidence Matters. There's definitely ways to learn about these things. But it sounds to me like, and I know from our experience, that these are pretty complex things. So, as we're going through it, any tips you can give along the way, I'm not asking you to do it right at this moment, but just keep in the back of your heads, any things that you can suggest to people, hey, you should go here and read about some of these things. Like, I heard, I can't remember if it was Leslie or Stephanie, but one of you said before, oh, you might want to go and read some of the rulings or whatever, what people have said. So maybe as we're talking today, you can give some guidance or just some tips on how to even do that for some people who may not know. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube Live, if you have questions, put them in that little chat box over on the side. They'll get relayed to me. I'll try and pass them along because, again, this is pretty complex. And the topic is complex. For those of you who are here at MedTech Innovator, put your questions for the Q&A into the Q&A button. For chat, for like immediate comments or clarification, put them in chat. All right, so let's go one more thing here. And again, just staying on this topic, for overall, are there some things like Leslie, maybe for you, that are common between, as you said, strategically, I'm a small company, I'm just trying to get my thing in my first market, or I want to just, as you said, prove that it works. What can I do maybe kind of in a low-hanging fruit way? Are there some markets that have the same, that do track each other like closely where, okay, if I can do it in Japan, I can do it in Australia, or what are some of those examples? So Leslie.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to be in APAC, that Japan and Korea are going to be probably two countries that you're going to see some similarities. Korea has some sort of coverage with evidence development programs where they'll help subsidize you doing the research. I actually went through that with a product called NanoKnife when I was at Angiodynamics. We used that, and it worked very successfully for us to establish reimbursement there. That the patient has to pay part and the government pays part, but it certainly helps to subsidize doing your clinical research. And I think that's one of the key things with small startups, right? It's very difficult for them to do research over and over and over again, right? Be in perpetual research. So they have to really be strategic and focus and say, okay, where am I going to get the biggest bang? And then where does that benefit roll over into another market? And that's how you map out your strategy. That's why it's really important to map all this out from the beginning. So I definitely would say those two countries. China's an entirely, and I'm gonna let somebody else speak on it because it's very, very complex and it's a whole other animal. But I think that if you're doing Japan, Korea, maybe even Australia, then you may get some benefit across those markets. Again, that would be my recommendation if you're in Asia. If you're in Europe, you get a lot of bang from NICE, not because the UK is a good market or you're going to get a good price there. But if they do some kind of, you do an MTEP, they publish it. And even the US private companies will cite to a NICE decision. And so if you have strong evidence, then I recommend NICE because it's going to be published and everybody in the world, even the other HTAs, are going to look at the NICE decision. So those are just some strategic things that I tell companies to think about.
And US, and so for companies in Asia that are thinking also of US as a primary market for them,
Yes.
Again, is there, as you said, because there's so many different people who are initiating coverage, so is there a particular strategy you advise if you're talking to somebody who's based here in Asia Pacific?
Yeah, I would do NICE before I come to the US because US private payers are going to look at NICE and it's not that expensive to go through NICE. It takes time, but if you're going to do MTEP, which is the best program to go through for devices, you don't really want a full HTA with NICE. You want to do MTEP, which is a cost consequence. But if you get a favorable ruling there, the interventional procedures doesn't have a whole lot of teeth to it. But if you get a favorable ruling in MTEP, then every US payer is going to look that up and they're going to see it. And then when they go to evaluate you and they see you have a favorable NICE ruling, chances are you're going to be in a much stronger position to get coverage in the US. But to try to come into the US and hit all the major US payers without a whole lot of evidence and years, it's a huge lift, even for large US companies. So I would take the other route. And maybe in France is another one where they have some good, they actually just launched some new programs where they help subsidize and will give short-term reimbursement while you're building your full dossier. So there are some definite countries that can help you prepare to come to the US that I would recommend first.
Thanks, Leslie. All right, Stephanie or Chris, either of you want to comment on that before we move on?
Maybe I'll just jump in first. Totally agree, I think, in the sense that Japan and Korea do have a lot of similarities and you may be able to leverage, and along with Taiwan, they would have similar requirements and characteristics. But I do have to say at the end of the day, this might be my personal opinion, but market access is extremely local, right? So it is, evidence by its nature tends to be global because it's published, it's out is in the public domain, right? So, but the processes, the stakeholder interests, the government directions and agendas, things like that, which really, really matter for decisions on funding, tend to be extremely local. So leverage what you can, but be very, very strategic where you go. And there are markets in Asia Pacific where, for example, you may not necessarily need to formally apply for access before you can actually get into the market. So if you're looking at the public sector in Australia, it has some similarities in the way it operates to the US. I think it might be a good testing ground, and it is funded through DRGs, and you don't need to have a formal decision or coverage. So I think that there are pockets where you can kind of pick and choose if you want to get started in Asia Pacific, but the overall, the similarities are very much at a high level, defining your unmet need, making sure you have the right evidence tailored to the stakeholder you're trying to convince, building that value proposition. Those are the commonalities, but the nuances, the details, cost structures, everything after that, processes will be fairly different depending on where you're going.
Yeah, and I know a lot of these companies don't have a department like you're fortunate to have, with a team who's able to research and figure all these things out. So, so for a smaller company that doesn't have those kinds of resources, I've heard things again so far about maybe working with some local governments or other agencies. Is there how do they maybe I'm going to go back to Leslie for a second here. You talk about government subsidizing. How do you even find out about those subsidies? How do you where do you call? Is there a website? What do you
So I would definitely say that today there is a movement towards, and I think Chris said at the beginning, where governments, like for instance, Australia, they give tons of tax credits to startups. That's just one way of doing it. But in a lot of countries like France, like Germany, like Korea, where literally they're doing these managed entry and the government is helping to subsidize the clinical evidence development. And that's a newer movement because it definitely was not like that when I came back into the device industry. And it's all about helping to encourage companies to develop evidence so that we move away from the world where every device is a tool, because they just aren't. Some devices are therapies, and we need, and agencies that are funding need to know what the value is, right? The clinical and the economic value. And so I guess they came to the realization, hey, we need to subsidize bringing these products to market. So a good place for companies to look, and how I early found out about some of these programs, is through my involvement with ISPOR. And even though ISPOR is focused on pharmacoeconomic outcomes research, there is a medical device sector and a diagnostic sector. And I don't know if it is as up to date, but I know I worked on a project some years ago where we tried to map what the reimbursement looked like in every country, every major market. And we included some of these programs, but they're constantly updating. Because like I said, France just came out with a new one like 3 weeks ago. But it is important to reach out to the major agencies and find out, hey, is there a way that we can get some subsidy to do the clinical research? If they think that now they're not going to just do it for any device, it has to be something with a high unmet need. That part is definitely clear. They're driven by that. So in other words, they're trying to incentivize people that are willing to do the hard work and coming up with real innovation. They're willing to subsidize the clinical research in those areas.
All right, so let's cover one other area, and then we're going to dig into some more detail here, and that is digital. So a lot of these therapies aren't devices anymore, right? A lot of these things are digital health now. And I know, Chris, you've authored a paper with APAC Med on digital health reimbursement. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. That's a pretty hot topic. So give us a little bit of a flavor for that.
I think these days there's not really a bifurcation of what is digital health and what is medical device. It's very integrated. I would imagine a lot of the people joining in today are kind of in a blurry world of both. So this is going to be relevant anyway. So yeah, quick shout out here for APAC Med, the kind of Asia Pacific equivalent of AdvaMed and MedTech Europe. They started a digital health committee in 2020, focusing on a few areas, interoperability, cybersecurity, regulation, but also reimbursement. So we worked for about a year during the COVID period on what should the reimbursement archetypes for digital health be in the Asia Pacific region. And here we're talking about more the kind of clinical grade stuff, right? The software as a medical device, those with clinical decision-making on the back of AI and ML, not just kind of the general wearables or apps. Because currently in the Asia Pacific, we have no value assessment frameworks for digital health. There's really no fit for purpose reimbursement pathways. And there's what's called the evidence paradox for digital health. So, governments are saying, hey, prove to us your evidence and we'll give you the reimbursement. And the digital health companies are saying, but I need to be implemented to, gather the evidence and then prove to you this thing is working, right? So we get kind of caught in this sort of paradox. So what we've done is there's a really fantastic work by the WHO to map how UHC can be expedited through digital health. So we kind of took that as a basis. Interestingly, we decided not to go down the path of HTA. We did kind of catalog what HTA is doing in the space of digital health, but we felt like at the moment, the arduous requirements of HTA kind of were counterintuitive to what we were trying to achieve with digital health and this evidence paradox. So we've put forth in this paper, and I think it can be shared, value assessment framework for digital health in the region, which looks at not just clinical and economic and social indicators, but also, do they improve workflow? What's the user experience like? Kind of work, employer satisfaction, clinical setting satisfaction as a result of the user experience of digital health. So we've tried to kind of incorporate some other things more relevant there. And we came up with some archetypes. So we looked at those countries that are kind of mostly public payer schemes that are on the more mature socioeconomic developed end in terms of how they can navigate a digital health reimbursement pathway, like Australia, as was mentioned. And we also created an archetype for those that are kind of mixed payer model and a little bit less mature on the socioeconomic developed end. Because actually what's cool about digital health is the potential implication in both of those archetypes is still absolutely enormous, right? Or just the pathways look a little bit different. So anyway, that's all out there. Maybe just to kind of make it very specific for people. So one specific action we're trying to do, and it goes back to studying what's going on out there. We're trying to implement the German model in the Asia region, which is that basically you have a year's sandbox of being approved and reimbursed to then gather the evidence you need to then come back and prove that, in fact, this was a good decision, right? So we're trying to get this model implemented, which we think will expedite stuff quite a bit. We're having ongoing multi-stakeholder dialogue forums happening, so people are welcome to join those. We just did one in Australia a couple of weeks ago. And in the report, we take the heart flow analysis example, which is a cardiovascular AI, and show how it's one of the few actually reimbursed digital health technologies in the region currently. So anyway, that's all out there, but very exciting. And I think whether you're pure digital health technology or kind of a mixed technology, this is all still very relevant.
Yeah, super relevant. And actually, there's a lot of similarity, I think, just conceptually, what you were just talking about in terms of sandboxing for a year, develop the evidence. I think that was a lot of kind of the concept behind MCIT, same idea, saying, hey, breakthrough technology, get it out there, let's get it to patients, let's develop that evidence. And then you can continue at a certain point. I know there's a lot of complexity there, Leslie, but same. I think some of these trends, I think, are kind of what we're hoping to do, right? Is get into this. Let's get these devices to patients. Let's build a body of evidence, real world evidence, all those things, right?
But I do want to kind of comment, because one of the challenges to digital health globally, and I think he's highlighted it, I don't know if people have picked it up, but Medicare, so in the United States, digital health, as you know, Paul, is not reimbursed. And that is because in 1965, when the Medicare law was written, no one anticipated digital health. And Medicare can't pay for something if there's not a benefit category. In the statute, it lays every benefit category that it will pay for. There have been a few devices that we found ways to sort of, like the diabetes remote monitoring devices. We found some ways to kind of go around it. Now we have 2 remote monitoring codes, but they don't pay for the devices, the technology itself. So until the law in America changes with Medicare, the private payers are not going to wholesale go out there and pay for digital health. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that there is a way, if you have evidence. So this is the key thing, though, where Chris said, in the US, they're like, no, give me evidence and then I'll pay. They're not going to pay for you to develop evidence on their dime. So I think that's what the digital health companies are running into, because most people that do digital health come from a technology background and not from a healthcare background. And they don't really understand how healthcare, how market access for healthcare is created. And so I think that's one of the challenges with digital health. The other thing is that there are clinical digital health interventions, and then there are what I would call process or back office. And in the US, we don't pay through reimbursement for process or back office, ever. So it doesn't matter how much easier you made the process or how much faster people can do it. We don't pay for that. Our system isn't set up to pay for that. So I think these are the challenges of the future. I think COVID maybe has been the biggest gift to the potential of digital health, because I think it is making regulators globally say we've got to figure out a way to unlock the power of digital health now, right? And so I do think I expect in the next 5 years to see the regulatory changes that we need and the legal changes to allow it to explode globally. But right now, that still we've not quite gotten there. And those are the things that have kept it from developing. And, and the truth is, if the United States won't pay for it, it's going to be really hard for the other countries, for globally, for it to take off the way that it needs to, just because of how much we fund healthcare in this country.
Yeah, let me clarify one thing too, because Leslie makes some good points there. So I think where we are advancing in the Asia Pacific is, changing the value assessment model using the German example, but also incorporating some additional characteristics that are more relevant for digital health than a classical medical device, right? So we're starting to make some ground in that sense. I think where we're still behind, and this is very tactical guidance for startups, is, we're still at the point of creating new charge codes specific for digital health, right? In fact, the guidance we're giving to startups is, hey, find the existing codes out there, especially as kind of the block funding comes down and the devolved decision making is more at the hospital level for digital health and medical technologies. Take the existing codes out there and just prove why you're a more cost efficient or better solution than a traditional intervention, right? So I don't want to make it sound like we're so advanced. It's still kind of a basic blocking and tackling move going on out here,
Right. No. I agree. I just wanted to kind of lay that, because I know a lot of these companies are thinking of coming to the US. And then what he just suggested in the US, you have to be very careful about. You can't really apply existing codes because the codes are set up by the AMA, and the prices are set by Medicare, and Medicare doesn't pay for digital health. So you have to be very careful about using the appropriate code, because in the US, we have this thing called false claims. And if the code wasn't really developed for that intervention, it could be a real legal snafu. So before someone says to you in America, oh, just use this code, you need to really get an expert to help you decide if this is appropriate, because it could lead you to have more problems than you're going to be prepared for. So that's something really important to consider in the US is it appropriate to use this code?
All right, let's just cover one more topic over here on reimbursement in the US, Leslie. And that's just kind of generally speaking, there's a lot of confusion often between, the components of payment in the US, coverage,
right,
reimbursement, payment. How are all these things? You started talking a little about AMA and codes. So just give us a little primer, not a big one, but a little primer on kind of the difference between.
I'll give you the condensed version of what I teach at the AbdoMed 101. So reimbursement is 3 things. It's coding, coverage, and payment. All right. And the codes basically are nothing but a numerical representation of what the action was. Right. So it's a way for the computer to recognize the definition of what happened. That's really all a code is. It is not payment or coverage. For a code to generate a payment, you must have coverage of that code. So there could be a code out there and one payer pays for that code, another payer does not. So it's really important to understand who covers the code and under what circumstances. And then the payment is obviously what that code is valued at. And in the US, all codes, physician codes, which are CPT codes, are valued by the AMA, or they decide to give a code. And then there's a committee within the AMA called the RUC. And the RUC proposes a value for the code. And then Medicare decides what to actually value it at. Okay. And that's one set of codes, physician codes. And then we have DRGs, which are in most countries, or not all countries. Germany has OPS codes, but and so does the UK. But we all know what DRGs. That's for inpatient stay, right? That represents the payment for the inpatient stay, and those are pretty much set by Medicare. And then you have your outpatient reimbursement codes, which is if you have the procedure as a day procedure or less than inpatient, then there's another amount set. Now, Medicare has a base set, and most device companies will publish the reimbursement that Medicare sets. However, commercial payers will negotiate with individual hospitals and individual doctors, and they may actually pay higher than what's published on a company's site, but the company does that sort of as a standard. so that people will know what the general reimbursement. Doesn't mean it's the exact, because private payers can pay something different, but Medicare is the standard in the US. And so that's what basically gets what's published. But coverage is key. That's what turns on the faucet. Code has to be covered. If it's not covered, no money gets paid.
I'm going to get a t-shirt that says coverage is the key.
Coverage is the key.
Coverage is the key. So thank you for that. That was very helpful. One of the things, on a lot of these discussions that we have with companies is, they're going to go out of pocket first. They're going to go, let patients, just pay for this. And especially in Asia Pacific, in some regions, we see that. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about that here in the Asia Pacific. What markets, regions tend to be out of pocket versus reimbursed? Stephanie.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because when I look at it, I do think there's directional trends, but there are markets that have, in the same country, you would have like a reimbursed market or like a self-pay market or different segments, right? So in fact, it's not necessarily divided at the country level in certain cases, but as an example, India or Southeast Asia would tend to be more of the self-pay markets. A large part of China, depending on the type of device you're talking about, right? Whether it's like an acute or interventional or therapeutic device or some other type of device. Some of it in China largely can be out of pocket as well. And how do I say this? I think that as a startup, you would want to kind of understand, if it's a viable path for you to kind of start with the out-of-pocket or self-pay kind of segments and then build your evidence base and then go for reimbursement so that you can kind of scale. But in general, if you do eventually want to be able to get to a large population, and depending on your device or innovation, it could be very niche or it could be intended for widespread use, right? You'd have a different strategy, but out of pocket would be usually the lower sort of willingness or ability to pay markets in Asia Pacific.
Okay, thank you. And I know even in the U.S. we see things that are similar with that too, right, Leslie? Where people will say, "Oh, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna go direct to consumer," and then, right?
Look, I have clients, and there are specific markets where you see it the most. You see it in prostate, because it takes so long to develop the evidence, right? Because we've got 30-year outcomes. People don't die from prostate cancer. So payers like this concept of active surveillance. So people that come up with prostate solutions, they try to go direct, they go for cash pay. And you also see it kind of in the obesity bariatric market, though that's starting to change. People are starting to see this as more health rather than cosmetic. But I think that a lot of the companies that are in that space started in a cash pay model. I will definitely tell you, it's just not a viable market long-term for any company in the US. And you see a lot of digital health companies. That's where you see it now. Oh, well, I'm going to go direct to consumer. Oh, you're going to go direct to consumer with something that detects AFib? I don't think so. No, that's not that's a clinical problem. You can't develop a device for a clinical problem and think you can go direct to consumer. One, the doctor's not going to accept the data. And two, people in the US are married to their health insurance, right? We do what our health insurance pays for. And if the health insurance doesn't pay for it, chances are we're going to take, they say, oh, I want an MRI. And then they find out, oh no, the MRI is going to cost you $6,000, but you can get a CT for $200. Oh, I'm going to have the CT. That tends to be the average American and how they think. But of course, there are these disease states where people will pay some money, but it's not enough to what I'd say. You're not going to build a company. You're not going to have Boston Scientific or J&J or Medtronic rushing out to buy you, because you're not going to generate enough revenue with the cash pay. And in digital health, if you're in the clinical space, forget it.
All right, good. Good. Thank you for that clarification. Let me move on topically here. We have about 15 more minutes in the live broadcast, and I want to cover a couple other things. So one of the questions that I know has been asked quite often is, is obtaining reimbursement an independent process from obtaining regulatory approval? It's for some people, it's a little confusing. So in Asia Pacific, can these things be done in parallel in some way, or do companies need regulatory approval first and then they go for reimbursement? So just quickly on that, maybe Stephanie, if you want to start.
Sure. So, okay, the short answer is yes, they're usually separate, but the caveat is that it kind of depends on where your funding is coming from, because if you're a device which is primarily funded at a procedure level, then, for example, in China, you would be able to create, or not you, but through the government processes and local hospitals, because in China, companies don't initiate applications for funding. So if you were in China, for example, then you could create a medical service fee even before you have regulatory approval of your device, because it's associated with a certain medical service or procedure. But if you're talking about like medical device specific coverage, so for example, Australia would be the only country in Asia Pacific where you can have a parallel process. So while the TGA review is undergoing for regulatory approval, you can apply for prosthesis listing. However, you wouldn't be able to actually get onto the list until you can provide the TGA like certificate, right? So there's still sort of that prerequisite, though you can apply and be reviewed in parallel. In the other major reimbursed markets for devices then, like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, you can only start after you have regulatory approval.
Well, so now I've had a different experience in Japan. So I did a C2 device, and so we had to get the designation from MHLW first. And PMDA is the department of MHLW, but they had to actually give it the designation, which is a high unmet need, kind of what I was saying before, and where they create a whole new procedure reimbursement. But we had to get that designation. There's actually a process. You get that designation, and then the file, when it goes to PMDA, they handle it differently than if you're just going for a C1 or what's the other, A1 or A2.
The B1s, B2s, yeah.
Yeah, B1s, B2s, yeah. So if you're doing a C2, it is a different process.
Correct, yeah. So I think, as Leslie pointed out, if it's like a procedure change, it tends to be possible. But if it's more like a device tied or device specific reimbursement, usually overall it would be like one after the other.
And thank you very much. And Leslie, back to you for this. In the US, I know that FDA has that payer task force where they try to bring payers in earlier in the process, even during approval, right? So to at least get some input from payers. Maybe you could tell us briefly about that, again, for companies that are here in Asia Pacific thinking about going to the US. What might they want to consider? Can you tell us a little bit?
I definitely recommend to companies that if they have the opportunity to do that, once they give you twice as long for your pre-sub, so that you can get the payer feedback. But you want that from the beginning, so that when you start out developing evidence, you're incorporating the needs of the payer from the beginning. Because otherwise, so you take what would be a consecutive process, right? Which that's why it used to be, if you were doing a PMA, it would take 12 years to get to reimbursement, right? Because you did the PMA study, which maybe took you 6 years or 7 years, and then you had to turn around and do a payer study. So that's a lot of time and money, right? And the goal was to bring that, when Murray Sheldon developed that payer task force, was to give that knowledge to companies in the pre-market so they could build one body of evidence. And if it takes 6 years, they've got the evidence for the FDA approval and for CMS. And that was even before de novos were really popular, when this was first developed. Now the de novos are popular. If you really know how to run a clinical trial, you might get through the whole process in 3 years. So I really encourage companies to do that, because it saves a lot of your patent time. It reduces your expenses. If you're very thoughtful about it when you're raising money, I'm on the board of several companies. Like, that matters to me. I do a lot of due diligence, have people sat down and really plotted out their evidence needs. Do they understand the needs of every stakeholder, right? The FDA, the payers, the hospitals, the physicians, like the patients, they need to understand all of their evidence needs. And ideally, when they do that pivotal trial, it should respond to the needs of all the key stakeholders. And if you do that right, then you can get to reimbursement a lot faster.
Yeah, and let me just add one more thing, and then Chris, I'll call on you. So just for everyone who's listening here, so that's like a service the FDA provides. So you can reach out to the FDA and say, hey, I would like to include payers in my pre-sub process, and they'll help you with that. Yeah. And that doesn't cost you per se, right? Anything. It's just something you need to, yeah, but you need to ask for. You need to know to ask for it. Chris, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I do have a view on this topic as well. So unfortunately, from my perspective, there is a graveyard of technologies that were approved but not reimbursed. They kind of went half the way and then didn't think about it. And, by then it was too late, right? So there's a kind of graveyard of those types of technologies. I think one thing, and we'll have a paper in Asia coming out here over the next kind of month or two, is we're recommending to startups more and more that they form what would be called a payer advisory board. So it kind of goes along the lines of we were talking about of engaging with the government services, but you see many startups that put a lot of effort into their clinical advisory board and strategic advisory board, but they don't seem to form a payer advisory board, which is equal, if not even of greater sort of importance, especially like when Stephanie said the decisions on medical technologies may be devolved down to the procedural or hospital level. So you just need people who understand how the decision can be made at that point once the product is approved, right? And I would, if you want kind of evidence that this is definitely the direction of travel, if you look at a lot of the investment theses these days, including some of the investments I'm working on, it's much less now about IP and regulatory and much more around what is your actual payer strategy, right? So if you don't have a payer advisory board and you don't have that strategy kind of thought through up from the beginning, the valuation of your company is going to be affected and you may end up in that graveyard kind of chasm,
So you brought it up, so I'm going to call on you a little more on this, Chris. Then, so how do you form a PAB? What's the process? How do you do that?
Yeah, like I said, we'll have a kind of paper coming out a little bit that we've been doing some evidence-based research on what works and what doesn't work in this space. But to be honest, I would argue, and I'm sure the others have a view on this as well. It's not too different from the mentality around forming your clinical or strategic advisory board, right? I mean, you want representation of different geographies, different types of stakeholders, but those who are specialized in the payer space. Of course, private payers are probably a little bit easier to approach on a topic like this, and they may even be an investor in your company. Sometimes public payers may not want to be on the board itself. You can engage with these government services, but that's where you can use kind of proxy groups. eSport was mentioned earlier on the call. I think eSport is a fantastic organization. You can find these kind of proxy voices for public payers as well. But, usually kind of 3 to 5 representatives of the payer group. Start that process early. It can sometimes be a subgroup of your overall kind of board structure, but just at least that there's an early dedicated effort on your payer strategy,
Great advice.
Yeah, I want to just add.
And eSport. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add.
Go ahead, Leslie.
So in the U.S., it's difficult. Payers, just as a policy, won't allow their employees to be on company boards. I've known very few cases where active employees can be on boards. So I do recommend, though, that startups consider putting on their strategic advisory board or on their actual board. Like I said, I'm on 3 boards, 1 public and 2 private. That if you can't create an actual payer board because of this barrier with companies won't allow people to serve on boards, that you find somebody that has real specialty knowledge here, and that you put them on your board of directors, because if people that really understand reimbursement should also really understand regulatory. And that's just a core knowledge that you need to have. It's really addresses your risks. And like I'm on the risk committee for all the companies that I work with. And so I do think it's important. I think he's absolutely right. You have to have that advice. Of course, there are lots of consulting firms out here. And that's the other thing. Every firm is not created equal. Do your diligence. And I'm sure Paul tells the companies that, but everybody that tells you that they are, a market access or reimbursement firm, people are not created equal. And if they don't know device, because I worked in pharma first, so I happen to know both. But if someone tells you, oh, I've done all my work in pharma and now that they want you to be their first device client, don't do it. Because it's a very different space and it's very unique. And you really should do your due diligence and understand what their background is. But Chris is right. You have to have that strategic guidance from the beginning. How you form it may be different from market to market based on what's allowed, but you got to have that. And you know, Paul, you know, I'm a strong believer in that.
I do know that, Leslie, and as I am as well. It's all about getting paid. So let's go to Stephanie here. Maybe for each of us, just quickly. I can't believe we only have 4 minutes left in the public broadcast. So let's get to some closing thoughts for each of you panelists. Again, some closing thoughts that you just want to share. We've been talking about a lot of things, some general advice that you want to give people, and also if people can reach out to you and connect with you, where do they find you? Is that on LinkedIn? How do they find you? So let me start with you, Stephanie.
Sure, I'm happy to connect to those if they have any questions via LinkedIn. And I think just touching on the last topic we've been talking about, right? So even if you're not able to form a peer group, or if you can't get anyone with that expertise onto your board, we've done like mock committees where people are assigned roles. You know, their job is to poke holes, right, in certain areas with that knowledge. So there's different ways you can think through your strategy. And I think touching on Leslie's last point too, I cannot emphasize how important it is to really think through together your access strategy with regulatory, with medical, clinical, and commercial strategy. Because, you know, you could claim that your device is completely, you know, the same as somebody else's just to get through regulatory, and then you are stranded later when you're trying to now then say it's differentiated. Oh, it's so different, you have to pay me more, right? Like that's such a problem. Please think through the consistency of your strategies. That's super, super important. And even the language you use in your regulatory dossier is important. Is it a catheter, a sheath, a probe? That will matter because definitions for coverage are really, really strict. So think through those things. That's my last message. Think through your strategy, like holistically cover everything you need to for your business, please, early.
Great advice, Stephanie. I saw Leslie clapping in the background on your messaging regarding, oh, I'm the same as everybody else, and then no, I'm different. That is definitely something we unfortunately see all the time. So Leslie, I'm going to go to you because I want to let you give us some more words here, and then we'll wrap up with Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stephanie like nailed it, and you know, and I think you've heard me say this. So I'll just give you what I believe every company should do. I believe every company should have a head of market access, and I believe regulatory and clinical and medical affairs should report to that person. And because you must have, and at my two companies where I built the function for Biomet and for angiodynamics, that's what we ultimately ended up building, because regulatory teams will default to, I can get it through like this. And they will be telling the truth. But as she said, now they've just destroyed the value of the device because the payers are like, but you just said you are substantially equivalent to something that we pay $2 for. And you want $2,000 for this. We'll give you $2, but if you want $2,000, there's no coverage. So having a team all come together. And another thing that I'm a big proponent of, even functions that don't traditionally participate in market access, when I work with clients, I take R&D, manufacturing, operations, all of these people through all of these questions. And the reason is because at first they're like, why? But it really, my goal is to align everybody to the same value. Because when everybody from whatever function they're coming from understands what the company has agreed the value is, then everyone will agree on how to develop that evidence. But if everyone doesn't, if you don't take them through that journey of bringing that internal alignment, then what one department thinks, oh, you can just do it like that. Another department thinks, oh, you can do it like that. And then they want the market access team to go to the payer with a smile on their face. And, you know, just because you're cute, you know, it just doesn't work that way. You got to, you know, so that internal alignment is really key. That's very, very important because it determines how people with the resources, right? You've got to resource evidence. And if people don't understand that and they're not aligned, it won't happen.
I predict you're going to be on some more boards after this lesson. All right. And then Chris, you warned us about that graveyard of devices that are approved but not paid for. And that is everyone, especially investors, the biggest fear, right? That there's going to be, you get approved and you get back in line to get paid. And a lot of times you don't make it. So let's give them some advice. How do we stay out of that graveyard? Chris, any other final thoughts?
I'll be quick because I know we're a little bit over time. So first of all, happy to connect on LinkedIn if people would like. Very always interested to learn about the latest tech out there and the trade ideas. I've learned a lot even just in the discussion here today. So thanks for arranging this. I just give you one very simple recommendation. People ask me sometimes, like, how do I become better at health economics or better at kind of payer engagement sort of discussions? And we've talked about a lot of very tactical things today, but I always tell people to get a copy of Love Languages and read it. And I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It's a kind of marriage counseling book, but it's all about different types of love. And it's not about the way you feel love. It's about how to interpret the way other people feel love and therefore to adapt your kind of method of communication and approach accordingly. And I think, as Leslie just said, value is definitely in the eye of the beholder. So depending on what type of product you have, what market, what season it's in the payer group, what cycle of the political aspect it's in, it's all about the way you're going to communicate that message across. You cannot just have all your facts and figures and numbers and expect that alone is going to achieve your goal. So get a copy of Love Languages and become an excellent communicator, both in your work life, but maybe in your home life as well.
That is some sage advice. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to get a copy of that book. I haven't read that. So thank you for that. And once again, I just want to thank all of you, panelists. You guys are tremendous. And Leslie, I know people can find you on LinkedIn too. I know you're there as well. So Leslie Weiss from Evidence Matters. So again, panelists, thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I definitely learned a ton today. So thank you guys for the discussion. It was really great. And just again, as a reminder, for those of you here on our cohort, don't go away. Time to put your questions into the Q&A so we can get to that private Q&A. For those of you on YouTube, thank you for tuning in. You can see our whole archive of all of our past webinars at medtechinnovator.org/APAC live. You can also see the schedule of what's coming up. As Frederick mentioned before, we've got some great discussions coming up in the coming weeks. So go there to look at our schedule. You can even subscribe to an email that'll come out weekly to let you know what's coming up. So thank you for tuning in today. Great to have you here. And for our panelists, don't go away. We're going to stick around for Q&A. And for everyone else, have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone on YouTube again in the coming weeks. So